In the corridors of power, where decisions shape destinies and words carry the weight of kingdoms, there exists a paradox so profound that most never grasp its essence until they have lost everything they sought to protect through explanation. Marcus Chen understood this truth only after watching his empire crumble beneath the weight of his own justifications. The boardroom fell silent as Marcus entered, his footsteps echoing against marble floors that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless corporate dynasties. 23 executives sat around the obsidian table, their faces masks of practiced neutrality, each one calculating the implications of what was to come. Marcus had called this meeting not to explain his recent decisions, those controversial acquisitions that had sent shockwaves through the industry, but to demonstrate a principle that would either cement his authority or expose him as a fraud. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying none of the defensive undertones that had characterized his recent public appearances. "I will not be explaining my actions today." The statement hung in the air like an executioner's blade, sharp and final. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, their prepared questions dying on their lips. Thomas Wright, the longest-serving member of the board, leaned forward with the confidence of someone who had never learned the danger of challenging silence with words. "Marcus, the shareholders deserve answers. The Meridian acquisition alone has cost us." "Cost us what, Thomas?" Marcus interrupted, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Money, reputation, or merely your comfort with the familiar?" The question was not a request for information, but a demonstration of control. Marcus had learned what ancient rulers knew instinctively. The moment you begin explaining your actions, you invite others to judge them. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken power dynamics. Thomas's face reddened slightly, but he found himself unable to formulate a response that didn't sound like pleading. This was the first demonstration of a truth Marcus had discovered through painful experience. Authority derives not from the ability to justify one's decisions, but from the capacity to make them and stand by them without seeking validation. Years earlier, Marcus had been a different man, one who believed in transparency, in the democratic process of decision-making, in the power of reason to convince and convert. He had explained every choice, justified every strategy, and sought consensus on every major move. His competitors had watched him telegraph his intentions through elaborate presentations and detailed rationales. They had studied his logic, found its weaknesses, and systematically dismantled his empire while he was still explaining why his approach was superior. The corporate world had taught him what the ancient philosophers knew, but modern society had forgotten. Explanation is the enemy of authority. When you explain, you submit your judgment to the judgment of others. You transform yourself from a leader into a defendant, from someone who acts into someone who justifies action. The very act of explanation implies that your decision requires external validation to be legitimate. Sarah Hendricks, the company's chief legal counsel, had witnessed Marcus's transformation from the eager-to-please executive of 5 years ago into the calculating strategist who now commanded absolute respect. She remembered the old Marcus, who would spend hours in her office pacing back and forth as he articulated his reasoning for every corporate maneuver. "Sarah, do you think the board will understand why I'm restructuring the Asian operations? Should I prepare a presentation explaining the long-term benefits?" He had been competent, intelligent, even visionary in his thinking. But he had been weak in the way that thoughtful people often are weak, addicted to the approval of others. The transformation had begun during the Blackwater crisis. Marcus's company had been hemorrhaging market share to a competitor whose strategy seemed irrational by conventional metrics. While Marcus prepared comprehensive analyses explaining why Blackwater Industries was doomed to failure, their CEO, Elena Vasquez, was systematically acquiring Marcus's key clients through bold moves that defied industry wisdom. When questioned by the financial press about her seemingly reckless expansion, Elena had simply smiled and said, "I don't explain strategy, I execute it." That single statement had cost Marcus more than $3 billion in market capitalization. Not because Elena's strategy was necessarily superior, but because her refusal to explain it made her appear strong, while Marcus's detailed justifications made him appear desperate for validation. The market, like most human institutions, respects strength over righteousness, confidence over correctness. The lesson had been brutal but complete. Marcus realized that in explaining his actions, he had been teaching his competitors how to defeat him. Every presentation, every press conference, every detailed strategic memo had been a masterclass in his thinking, delivered free of charge to those who sought to destroy him. He had been like a general who publicly discusses his battle plans before engaging the enemy. But the deeper insight came later, during those long nights when he sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights below and contemplating the ruins of everything he had built through careful explanation. The problem wasn't simply tactical, it was psychological. By constantly justifying his decisions, he had trained himself to think like someone whose judgment was perpetually on trial. He had become addicted to external validation, unable to act with conviction because he was always mentally preparing his defense. The man who explains is the man who doubts. The man who doubts cannot lead with the certainty that followers require. Leadership, Marcus had learned, is not about being right, it is about being decisive. The world is full of people who were right but powerless, and those who were wrong but unstoppable. The difference lies not in the quality of their judgment, but in their willingness to exercise it without seeking permission. This realization had precipitated what Marcus privately called the destruction. Not the destruction of his enemies or his market position, that would come later, but the destruction of his weak self. The version of himself that needed to be understood, appreciated, and validated. The version that confused explanation with leadership and justification with strength. The process had been excruciating. Like an addict withdrawing from a drug, Marcus had to learn to function without the steady stream of approval he had always craved. When the board questioned his decisions, his instinct was to launch into elaborate justifications. Instead, he learned to say simply, "This is the path we're taking." When journalists pressed him for explanations, he responded with, "My actions will speak for themselves." When competitors tried to bait him into revealing his strategy through public challenges, he remained silent. The initial response was predictable. Those around him interpreted his silence as arrogance, his refusal to explain as contempt for their intelligence. Some board members threatened to resign. Several key executives actually did leave, uncomfortable with what they perceived as his new authoritarian style. The financial press, deprived of their usual access to his thinking, began writing increasingly critical pieces about his secretive management style. But something remarkable happened. As Marcus stopped explaining himself, others began providing their own explanations for his behavior. The human mind abhors a vacuum, especially when it comes to understanding the motivations of those in power. When a leader refuses to explain his actions, others rush to fill that silence with their own interpretations. And these interpretations are invariably more flattering than any explanation the leader might have provided himself. Board members who had once questioned his every move began to assume that his silence concealed deep strategic thinking they weren't sophisticated enough to understand. Competitors who had once dismissed his detailed strategies as predictable began to view his new approach as evidence of hidden depths they had previously underestimated. The financial press, forced to speculate about his intentions rather than report his explanations, began to treat him as a mysterious figure whose moves deserved careful analysis rather than casual dismissal. The first major test of his new approach came during the Meridian acquisition that had so troubled Thomas Wright. Meridian Technologies was a failing biotech company with promising research but catastrophic management. Every traditional metric suggested that acquiring it would be financial suicide. When Marcus announced the acquisition, the entire industry expected a detailed explanation of how he intended to turn around such a disaster. Instead, Marcus simply said, "Meridian will be integrated into our operations within 6 months. No business plan, no financial projections, no timeline for profitability, just a statement of intent, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't feel the need to justify his decisions to anyone." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Meridian's stock price tripled overnight as investors assumed that Marcus's willingness to acquire it without explanation meant he saw value that wasn't apparent to others. Competing firms began scrambling to understand what they had missed, launching their own investigations into Meridian's potential. The company that had been worthless suddenly became the center of intense industry attention, all because Marcus had refused to explain why he wanted it. The irony was exquisite. By not explaining the acquisition, Marcus had created more value than any explanation could have achieved. The market's assumption that his silence concealed superior knowledge had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Within 3 months, 2 other major corporations made unsolicited offers for Meridian at prices far exceeding what Marcus had paid. But the acquisition itself was only the surface manifestation of a deeper principle that Marcus had internalized. The man who explains is always responding to other people's frameworks, operating within intellectual boundaries that others have established. The man who acts without explanation forces others to respond to his framework, to operate within boundaries he has created. This was why Thomas Wright now sat speechless at the boardroom table. For years, he had been accustomed to evaluating Marcus's proposals, judging them according to criteria he understood and found comfortable. But faced with decisions that weren't submitted for his approval, he found himself intellectually disarmed. Without explanations to critique, he could only react to results, and the results spoke a language that rendered his objections irrelevant. The transformation wasn't merely professional, it was philosophical. Marcus had discovered that the need to explain oneself is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of power. Most people believe that authority comes from being right, from having good reasons for one's actions. But true authority comes from the capacity to act decisively in the absence of certainty, to make choices that others cannot or will not make, regardless of whether those choices can be fully justified. This insight had ancient precedents. The great leaders of history, Caesar, Napoleon, Churchill, were not great because they could explain their decisions, but because they could make them. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he didn't convene a committee to discuss the legal implications of his action. When Napoleon marched on Moscow, he didn't submit his plans for peer review. When Churchill defied conventional wisdom to resist Nazi Germany, he didn't waste time explaining why appeasement was futile. These leaders understood intuitively what Marcus had learned through bitter experience. Explanation is the luxury of those who aren't responsible for results. Advisors explain, consultants explain, academics explain, leaders act. The distinction is crucial because it reflects a fundamental difference in mindset. The person who explains is always partially detached from their decision, maintaining enough psychological distance to analyze and justify it. The person who acts without explanation is fully committed to their choice, having internalized the responsibility for its consequences without reservation. This total commitment creates what Marcus had begun to think of as existential authority, the power that comes not from external validation but from complete ownership of one's decisions. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop seeking permission from others to be who you are. You become the final authority on your own life, the ultimate judge of your own actions. The psychological transformation this creates is profound. Most people live in a constant state of internal negotiation, perpetually preparing justifications for their choices, anticipating objections, seeking approval. This inner dialogue consumes enormous mental energy and creates a fundamental uncertainty that others can sense and exploit. The person who has destroyed their need for external validation operates from a different psychological foundation entirely, one of unshakable self-authority. Marcus had experienced this shift viscerally. The old Marcus had been constantly anxious about how others perceived his decisions, mentally rehearsing explanations and justifications even when alone. The new Marcus felt a profound inner silence where that anxiety had once lived. He made decisions and moved on, carrying none of the psychological residue that comes from constantly second-guessing oneself through the imagined eyes of others. This inner transformation had manifested in every aspect of his leadership. Where he had once sought consensus, he now simply decided. Where he had once explained his reasoning, he now demonstrated it through action. Where he had once invited critique, he now presented results. The change was so fundamental that even his physical presence had shifted. People who had known him for years remarked that he seemed different, more solid somehow, as if he occupied space with greater certainty than before. The business world had responded predictably. Some competitors dismissed his new approach as a temporary affectation, assuming that he would eventually revert to his old patterns of over-communication and eager explanation. But others recognized something more significant: the emergence of a leader who had learned to operate from genuine authority rather than borrowed credibility. David Park, CEO of Hartwell Industries and Marcus's most sophisticated competitor, had been among the first to recognize the implications of Marcus's transformation. "He's become dangerous," Park had told his executive team during a strategic planning session, "not because he's doing anything we can't counter, but because we can no longer predict what he's going to do. A man who doesn't explain himself is a man who isn't bound by conventional logic." Park's observation reflected a deeper truth about the relationship between explanation and predictability. When leaders explain their actions, they reveal their decision-making processes, making their future choices easier to anticipate and counter. But leaders who act without explanation force their competitors to respond reactively. Always one step behind, always trying to decode intentions that aren't explicitly revealed. This strategic advantage was only the beginning. As Marcus's new approach proved successful, it began to attract a different quality of followers. Instead of the consensus seekers and validation addicts who had populated his previous teams, he found himself surrounded by people who were drawn to decisive leadership. These were individuals who preferred clear direction to endless discussion, who valued results over process, who were willing to trust a leader's judgment rather than constantly second-guessing it. The shift in organizational culture was dramatic. Meetings that had once lasted hours as every decision was debated and explained now concluded in minutes with clear directives and immediate action. Projects that had once stalled in committees while every stakeholder demanded justification now moved forward with swift efficiency. The company began operating with a speed and decisiveness that competitors found impossible to match. But the personal cost of this transformation couldn't be ignored. In destroying his weak self, the part that needed to be understood and appreciated, Marcus had also destroyed certain relationships that depended on that weakness. Colleagues who had enjoyed the illusion of equality that comes from constantly questioning a leader's judgment found themselves uncomfortable with his new authority. Friends who had been accustomed to his eager explanations felt shut out by his increasing silence. Sarah Hendricks had been among those most affected by the change. She remembered the late-night conversations when Marcus would process every major decision aloud, seeking her input and validation. Those conversations had made her feel essential, integral to his success. Now Marcus made decisions in solitude and communicated only what was necessary for implementation. The relationship remained professional and respectful, but the intimacy of shared uncertainty was gone. "I miss the old Marcus sometimes," she had confided to a colleague. "He was more human, I guess, more accessible. This version is more effective, but also more remote." Her observation captured something essential about the price of true authority. It requires a certain loneliness, a willingness to bear the full weight of leadership without the comfort of constantly sharing that burden through explanation and justification. This loneliness wasn't accidental. It was structural. The moment a leader begins explaining their decisions to subordinates, they transform those subordinates into judges of their judgment. They create a dynamic where their authority is constantly subject to review and approval. To maintain genuine authority, a leader must be willing to stand alone with their decisions, to bear the full responsibility without seeking to dilute it through consensus or understanding. Marcus had discovered this truth through the painful process of implementing increasingly difficult decisions while maintaining his new policy of minimal explanation. When he decided to close the European operations, a move that would cost 3,000 jobs, every instinct screamed for him to explain the necessity, to help his team understand the economic realities that forced such a choice. Instead, he simply announced the decision and began implementation. The response was brutal. Protesters gathered outside corporate headquarters. Employees who had never questioned his judgment openly criticized his callousness. The media portrayed him as a heartless executive who valued profits over people. Every fiber of his old self demanded that he explain the financial pressures that made the closure inevitable, the alternative scenarios he had considered, the genuine anguish the decision had caused him. But he remained silent. Not because he didn't care about the human cost, but because he understood that explanation would not reduce the pain. It would only undermine his ability to make such decisions in the future. The moment he began justifying difficult choices, he would train himself and others to expect such justifications, making every subsequent hard decision subject to approval by those who didn't bear ultimate responsibility for consequences. The European closure proved to be the turning point that solidified his transformation. By refusing to explain a decision that seemed inexplicable, he forced observers to judge him by results rather than intentions. 6 months later, when the company's streamlined operations allowed them to acquire a major European competitor at a fraction of its previous value, creating more jobs than had been lost in the closure, his silence was retroactively vindicated. But vindication wasn't the point. Marcus had learned that the leader who requires vindication is still psychologically dependent on external approval. True authority means being willing to be wrong, to be misunderstood, to be criticized, without feeling the need to defend or explain. It means accepting that leadership sometimes requires making choices that cannot be justified to those who will never bear the ultimate responsibility for consequences. This acceptance had created what Marcus thought of as operational detachment, the ability to make decisions without being emotionally invested in how others perceived them. It wasn't indifference to results or callousness toward people affected by his choices. Rather, it was freedom from the psychological burden of constantly managing other people's opinions about his leadership. The detachment had made him more effective in ways he hadn't anticipated. When negotiating with other executives, his unwillingness to explain his positions made him unpredictable and therefore difficult to manipulate. When competitors tried to decode his strategy, his silence forced them to make assumptions that were often wrong. When employees sought to understand his priorities, his actions spoke louder than any explanation could have. But perhaps most importantly, the detachment had taught him to trust his own judgment in ways that constant explanation had made impossible. The old Marcus had been so accustomed to filtering his decisions through other people's reactions that he had lost touch with his own instincts. Every choice had been a collaborative effort, negotiated and refined through endless discussion, till the final result bore little resemblance to his initial vision. The new Marcus made decisions from a place of inner authority that didn't require external validation. He gathered information, consulted experts when necessary, but the actual choice came from a psychological space that belonged entirely to him. This created a quality of decisiveness that others found both inspiring and intimidating. The presence of someone who wasn't seeking permission to be who they were. Thomas Wright finally broke the silence that had dominated the boardroom since Marcus's refusal to explain the Meridian acquisition. "Marcus, we're not asking for a detailed explanation. We just want to understand the strategic thinking behind—" "No, Thomas?" Marcus interrupted quietly. "You want to evaluate my judgment using criteria that made sense in a world that no longer exists. The strategic thinking you're asking for assumes that I owe you an explanation, that my decisions require your approval to be legitimate. That assumption is what's killing companies like ours, while more decisive competitors take our market share." The statement wasn't angry or defensive. It was simply factual. Marcus had identified the core issue that separated leaders from managers, authorities from administrators. Managers explain because their power comes from consensus and approval. Leaders act because their authority comes from responsibility and results. "But how can we support decisions we don't understand?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the company's youngest board member, her voice carrying the frustration of someone trained to believe in transparency and collaboration. Marcus looked at her with something approaching compassion. "Jennifer, when you were a child, did your parents explain every decision they made? When they chose your school, your bedtime, your diet, did they submit these choices for your approval?" She shook her head, looking confused by the comparison. "Of course not. Because their authority didn't come from your understanding, it came from their responsibility for your welfare. They made decisions based on knowledge and judgment you didn't possess, accepting consequences you couldn't even comprehend." The analogy wasn't perfect, but it illustrated a crucial point about the nature of authority. Real authority doesn't depend on the understanding or approval of those subject to it. It derives from the willingness to bear ultimate responsibility for consequences. Parents don't explain themselves to children not because they're tyrants, but because the parent-child relationship is inherently asymmetrical in terms of responsibility and consequence. Similarly, the relationship between leaders and followers is asymmetrical in ways that explanation cannot bridge. The leader who constantly explains their decisions to followers is attempting to create false symmetry, to pretend that the burden of responsibility is shared when it actually rests entirely on their shoulders. This pretense may feel more democratic, but it weakens the very authority that makes effective leadership possible. Marcus had learned this lesson through observing Elena Vasquez, the competitor whose refusal to explain her strategy had initially cost him billions. During a chance encounter at an industry conference, she had shared an insight that crystallized his understanding of the relationship between silence and power. "Marcus," she had said, "you've always been the smartest person in the room. But intelligence without authority is just interesting conversation. I'm not smarter than you. I'm just willing to be wrong alone rather than right in committee." That's the difference between leaders and advisors. Her words had cut deep because they were accurate. Marcus had been operating as an advisor to his own company, constantly seeking input and approval for decisions that were ultimately his alone to make. By explaining everything, he had been diluting his own authority, transforming himself from the person responsible for results into the person responsible for justifying decisions to those who would never bear the consequences of being wrong. The revelation had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about his psychology. His need to explain hadn't really been about transparency or collaboration. It had been about fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being criticized, fear of bearing the full weight of leadership without the comfort of shared responsibility. Explanation had been his way of hedging bets, of ensuring that if things went badly, he could point to the consensus that had supported his choice. But consensus is the enemy of excellence. The decisions that create extraordinary results are usually the ones that seem wrong to conventional wisdom, that require betting everything on judgment that cannot be fully explained or justified to others. The leader who needs consensus will never make such decisions, will never achieve anything beyond what committees can envision and approve. This understanding had led to what Marcus privately called the Great Simplification. Instead of complex strategic frameworks that required elaborate justification, he began operating from simple principles that needed no explanation. Instead of detailed analyses that attempted to anticipate every variable, he began making decisions based on incomplete information and his own judgment. Instead of seeking buy-in from stakeholders, he began simply informing them of choices already made. The simplification had been terrifying initially. The old Marcus had found comfort in complexity, in the elaborate intellectual structures that made his decisions appear rational and defensible. Stripping away those structures left him naked before the possibility of error, dependent entirely on his own judgment without the protective buffer of collective reasoning. But the terror had given way to something more powerful: genuine confidence. When you stop trying to explain your decisions to others, you stop overanalyzing them yourself. When you accept that you might be wrong without needing to prove you're right, you become free to act on imperfect information with perfect commitment. When you embrace the loneliness of ultimate responsibility, you discover the strength that comes from not needing anyone else's permission to be who you are. The boardroom had fallen silent again, but this time the silence felt different, less confrontational, more contemplative. Marcus could see the members processing not just his words, but the entire demonstration of authority he had provided. By refusing to explain the Meridian acquisition, he had shown them something they had never seen before: a leader who didn't need their approval to lead. Jennifer Walsh was the first to speak, her voice thoughtful rather than challenging. "So you're saying that explanation weakens authority because it makes leadership subject to the approval of followers?" "I'm saying," Marcus replied carefully, "that the moment you begin explaining your decisions, you invite others to judge them. And the moment others are judging your decisions, you're no longer leading. You're performing for an audience that doesn't bear responsibility for results." The distinction resonated through the room with the force of revelation. These were all intelligent people who had spent their careers in leadership positions, but most had never considered the psychological dynamics that made real authority possible. They had confused management with leadership, administration with command, consensus with strength. David Kim, the board's financial expert, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "But surely there's a difference between explaining strategy to competitors and communicating with your own team." Marcus considered the question carefully. "David, every explanation teaches those who hear it how to evaluate your judgment. Whether they're competitors or colleagues, they learn your decision-making process, your priorities, your weaknesses. The information you share in the name of transparency becomes the weapon they use to second-guess your future choices. The insight applied beyond business. In every realm of human activity, explanation creates vulnerability. Politicians who explain their positions in detail give opponents specific targets to attack. Negotiators who reveal their reasoning provide the other side with information about their priorities and constraints. Even parents who constantly justify their rules to children undermine their own authority by suggesting that parental decisions are subject to juvenile approval. This didn't mean that communication was unnecessary. It meant that the type of communication mattered enormously. Commands were different from explanations. Directives were different from justifications. Information sharing was different from seeking approval. The leader who confused these distinctions would find their authority gradually eroded by their own words. Marcus had learned to communicate with surgical precision, sharing exactly what others needed to know to implement his decisions, while revealing nothing about the reasoning that led to those decisions. When he announced the closure of European operations, he had provided detailed information about timing, process, and support for affected employees. What he hadn't provided was justification for the decision itself, reasoning that could be debated and challenged by those who would never bear responsibility for consequences. The approach required extraordinary self-discipline. Every human instinct pushes towards explanation, especially when decisions are difficult or controversial. The need to be understood is so fundamental that resisting it feels almost unnatural. But Marcus had discovered that this resistance was the price of genuine authority. The willingness to be misunderstood rather than weak, isolated rather than validated, criticized rather than compromised. Sarah Hendricks had been watching the boardroom dynamics with fascination. As the company's chief legal counsel, She understood better than most how Marcus's transformation had affected organizational culture. The legal department had always been involved in extensive risk analysis for major decisions, providing detailed assessments that Marcus would use to explain and justify his choices to various stakeholders. Now, Marcus made decisions and asked legal to figure out how to implement them. The shift had been jarring initially. Sarah was accustomed to being a strategic advisor, helping to shape decisions through her analysis, but she had come to appreciate the clarity that came from knowing exactly what needed to be accomplished, rather than endlessly debating what should be attempted. "Marcus," she said, breaking into the conversation, "I've noticed that your new approach has changed how the entire organization operates. People seem more decisive, more willing to take action without endless committee review. Is that intentional?" Marcus nodded. "Leadership is contagious, Sarah. When people see their leader operating from genuine authority rather than seeking constant approval, they begin to internalize those same patterns. They stop explaining themselves to death and start taking responsibility for results." The observation touched on something crucial about organizational psychology. In companies where leaders constantly explain and justify their decisions, employees learn to do the same. They become addicted to consensus, unwilling to act without committee approval, paralyzed by the need to anticipate and address every possible objection. The result is organizations that move with glacial slowness, always explaining why they can't do something rather than figuring out how to do it. But in organizations where leaders operate from silent authority, employees begin to adopt similar patterns. They make decisions within their spheres of responsibility without seeking constant validation. They communicate what needs to be done rather than why it needs to be done. They focus on results rather than process, on implementation rather than endless analysis. The cultural transformation Marcus had observed was profound. Meetings that had once been exercises in collective explanation had become efficient working sessions focused on execution. Projects that had once stalled in analysis paralysis were completed with swift decisiveness. The entire organization had become more agile, more responsive, more effective, not because people were smarter or more skilled, but because they had learned to operate from authority rather than seeking permission. "But doesn't this approach risk creating an authoritarian culture?" asked Michael Torres, the board's newest member, his voice carrying the concern of someone trained in modern management theory. "What about collaboration, diverse perspectives, inclusive decision-making?" The question reflected common misconceptions about the relationship between authority and authoritarianism. Marcus had wrestled with similar concerns during his transformation, worried that embracing genuine authority might make him a tyrant, but he had discovered crucial distinctions that modern leadership theory often obscured. "Michael," Marcus replied, "authoritarianism is what happens when weak leaders use explanation and justification to control others. They create elaborate systems of rules and procedures that everyone must follow, detailed explanations that everyone must accept. True authority doesn't need such systems because it doesn't depend on controlling others. It depends on controlling oneself." The distinction was subtle but crucial. Authoritarian leaders are actually explaining constantly, explaining why their rules must be followed, why their systems must be obeyed, why their judgments must be accepted. They use explanation as a form of control, attempting to manage other people's thoughts and behaviors through detailed justification and elaborate reasoning. Leaders who operate from genuine authority don't need to control others because they have complete control over themselves. They make decisions without requiring others to understand or approve of them. They take responsibility for results without sharing blame for failures. They create space for others to operate from their own authority rather than demanding submission to external systems of explanation and justification. In fact, Marcus continued, this approach creates more freedom for others, not less. When I stopped explaining my decisions, I also stopped requiring others to explain theirs to me. Sarah makes legal decisions based on her expertise. David makes financial decisions based on his analysis. Jennifer makes operational decisions based on her judgment. They don't need my permission because they operate from their own authority within their spheres of responsibility. The organizational structure that emerged from this approach was flatter and more responsive than traditional hierarchies. Instead of multiple layers of approval and explanation, decisions were made by the people closest to relevant information and implemented immediately. Instead of complex systems of justification and review, there were simple accountability structures focused on results. But the approach required hiring and developing people who could operate from genuine authority rather than seeking constant guidance and approval. Many employees who thrived in explanation-heavy cultures struggled in environments where they were expected to make decisions and bear responsibility for outcomes without detailed justification to supervisors. This had led to significant turnover during the transition period. Employees who were psychologically dependent on consensus and validation found Marcus's new culture uncomfortable and eventually left for companies that still operated on traditional models of extensive explanation and collaborative decision-making. The departures had been painful but ultimately beneficial. They cleared space for people who preferred decisive leadership to endless committee review. The hiring process had also evolved. Instead of seeking candidates who could provide elaborate explanations for their past decisions, Marcus began looking for people who could demonstrate results without extensive justification. Instead of asking detailed questions about decision-making processes, he focused on outcomes and the ability to take responsibility for them. "We learned," Sarah observed, "that there's a big difference between people who can explain what they've done and people who can do what needs to be done. The best performers rarely waste time justifying their approaches. They focus their energy on achieving objectives." This insight had broader implications for how authority develops in individuals. People who spend their time explaining and justifying their decisions rarely develop the deep confidence that comes from repeatedly trusting their own judgment. They become dependent on external validation, unable to act decisively when consensus isn't available or when popular opinion opposes their instincts. But people who learn to act from their own authority, who make decisions and accept responsibility for outcomes without seeking constant approval, develop what Marcus had come to think of as existential muscle. They become comfortable with uncertainty, capable of acting on incomplete information, willing to be wrong without needing to prove they were right. The development of this existential muscle was crucial for anyone seeking genuine authority. It required deliberately choosing to act without explanation in situations where explanation would be easier and more comfortable. It meant accepting criticism without defending oneself, making unpopular decisions without seeking understanding, bearing responsibility without sharing blame. Marcus had developed this muscle through a series of increasingly difficult tests. Each time he chose silence over explanation, action over justification, responsibility over consensus, he strengthened his capacity for genuine authority. The process had been uncomfortable but ultimately liberating. Freedom from the psychological burden of constantly managing other people's opinions about his leadership, the boardroom discussion was approaching its natural conclusion. Marcus could see that the members had gained insight into principles they had never explicitly considered, though whether they would have the courage to implement these insights in their own leadership remained to be seen. Most people understood the logic of silent authority intellectually but found it too psychologically demanding to practice consistently. "One final question," said Thomas Wright, his tone more thoughtful than confrontational now. "If you don't explain your decisions, how do you know if you're making good ones? How do you get feedback? Learn from mistakes, improve your judgment." The question touched on something crucial about the relationship between explanation and learning. Marcus had discovered that the constant need to explain decisions actually interfered with learning from them. When you're focused on justifying choices to others, you're less able to honestly assess their outcomes. When you're psychologically invested in being right about decisions you've had to defend, you become less capable of recognizing when those decisions were wrong. "Thomas," Marcus replied, "I learn from results, not from other people's opinions about my reasoning. When the meridian acquisition succeeds or fails, the outcome will teach me more about the quality of my judgment than any amount of explanation or discussion beforehand could have revealed." This represented a fundamental shift in how learning occurred. Instead of learning through consensus and discussion, which inevitably reflected group biases and conventional wisdom, Marcus had learned to let reality be his teacher. Results didn't lie or seek to please. The approach required developing comfort with being wrong, in ways that explanation-dependent leaders rarely experienced. When your decisions don't require justification to others, you can acknowledge mistakes without losing face. When you're not psychologically invested in being right about choices you've had to defend, you can learn from errors without cognitive dissonance. "The man who explains is always partially detached from his decisions," Marcus continued. "He maintains enough psychological distance to analyze and justify them, but that same distance prevents him from fully learning from outcomes. When you're completely committed to your choices, When you own them without reservation, you become much more sensitive to feedback from reality. This sensitivity created a faster and more accurate learning loop than explanation-based approaches could provide. Instead of filtered feedback from people who might have their own agendas or limitations, Marcus received direct feedback from results. Instead of learning what he should have done according to other people's theories, he learned what actually worked in practice. The distinction had profound implications for personal development. People who constantly explain their decisions to others learn to think like people whose judgment is perpetually on trial. They develop sophisticated skills in justification and defense, but these same skills can interfere with the honest self-assessment that genuine learning requires. People who learn to act from silent authority develop different mental habits. They become comfortable with uncertainty, skilled at acting on incomplete information, capable of changing course quickly when results suggest their initial judgment was wrong. They focus their intellectual energy on understanding reality rather than managing other people's perceptions of their reasoning. As the meeting concluded, Marcus could see that he had accomplished something more significant than simply defending the Meridian acquisition. He had demonstrated a different way of exercising authority, one that didn't depend on consensus or approval, but on the willingness to take complete responsibility for decisions and their consequences. Some board members would undoubtedly find this approach uncomfortable and would continue to pressure him for more explanation and justification. Others would recognize the effectiveness of silent authority and begin developing it in their own leadership. But regardless of their individual responses, they had all witnessed something rare in the modern business world: a leader who didn't need their permission to lead. The transformation from explanation-dependent manager to silent authority had taken Marcus years to complete and had required destroying fundamental aspects of his identity. The man who had once needed to be understood and appreciated by everyone had died, replaced by someone who was content to be misunderstood as long as he was effective. The person who had once sought validation through elaborate justification had been replaced by someone who found satisfaction in results alone. This death and rebirth represented more than a change in management style. It was a fundamental shift in how Marcus related to power, responsibility, and his own identity. He had learned that true strength comes not from the ability to explain yourself to others, but from the capacity to be yourself without explanation, not from the skill to justify your actions, but from the willingness to accept complete responsibility for their consequences, not from the need to be understood, but from the courage to be effective. The principle that silences authority had become more than a strategic insight. It had become a way of being in the world. Marcus no longer explained himself because he no longer needed to. He had destroyed the weak self that required constant validation and built in its place something more solid and lasting. A person who could act from genuine authority because he owned every decision completely and without reservation. As the board members filed out of the room, Marcus remained seated, staring out the window at the city below. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new challenges, new opportunities to exercise the authority he had worked so hard to develop. Some of those decisions would prove to be mistakes, but he would learn from them without having to defend them. Some would be successes, but he wouldn't need to explain how he had achieved them. In the silence of the empty boardroom, Marcus understood something that few leaders ever discover: the man who destroys his weak self, the part that needs to be understood, appreciated, and validated, can never be destroyed by others. He becomes unshakable, not because he's always right, but because he's willing to be wrong without seeking permission or offering explanations. He becomes powerful not because he can justify his authority, but because he no longer needs to. The lesson was complete, the transformation final. Marcus Chen had become what Elena Vasquez had recognized years earlier. Not the smartest person in the room, but the one willing to be wrong alone rather than right in committee. In that willingness lay a strength that no amount of explanation could provide, and no external challenge could diminish. He had learned to lead not by convincing others of his righteousness, but by accepting complete responsibility for his choices and their consequences. This was the ultimate authority, not the power to make others agree with you, but the strength to act without needing their agreement at all. In the gathering darkness outside his window, Marcus could see the lights of 100 other buildings where other executives were probably explaining their decisions, seeking consensus, managing opinions, and slowly surrendering their authority to the very people they sought to lead. He had traveled that same path once, had been trapped in the same cycle of explanation and justification that weakens leaders while appearing to strengthen them. Breaking free had required destroying everything he thought he knew about leadership and rebuilding from principles that seemed harsh but proved to be liberating. The silence in the room was profound, but it was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, pregnant with decisions yet to be made, heavy with the weight of responsibility willingly accepted. Marcus had learned to love this silence, to find in it the space where genuine authority lives and breathes. It was the silence of someone who no longer needed to explain himself to anyone, including himself. In that silence, he was finally free.